Dixmoor is one of those places where thousands of people drive by on the freeway without ever stopping through and driving through the surface streets of the city. But there's not much of a reason to, because Dixmoor has been a dying community for quite some time.
Dixmoor is a small and poverty-stricken suburb that's about 20 miles south of the Chicago Loop. Surrounded by industrial ruins, Dixmoor's ugly, decaying, blighted, the infrastructure is deteriorating, much of the crime goes unreported. Dixmoor is a broke village in which a lot of that is due to a history of not only being a poverty-stricken suburb, but also for having corrupt leaders. You can really think of Dixmoor as being a northern extension of Harvey, and if you want to see a video on that city, you can through this link here. You should really watch this video first though, because, well, you just should. There isn't always a reason for these things. Alright, so if you haven't heard, Dixmoor's ugly-looking water storage tank has become the face of the town. Not that long prior to me uploading this video, Dixmoor declared a state of emergency after a total of 15 water main breaks that were going on at the same time. Now, for a town of less than 3,000 people, that's insane. That's like one water main break for every 200 residents. That's a higher ratio of water main breaks per resident than Dixmoor has police officers per resident. That's even more water main breaks per resident than Dixmoor has firefighters per resident because, there has been no Dixmoor Fire Department since 2013. The water main breaks from earlier this year were so bad that they forced schools to close for multiple days as if they were snow days. Some residents were told to boil water for the foreseeable future, while other residents didn't even have water at all. Now for you that might sound like a miserable way to live, and yeah, it is, but unfortunately Dixmoor residents are used to it at this point. Water main breaks have occurred in Dixmoor dating back to 2021. These water main breaks aren't just occurring in the dog days of winter either, when water mains are more vulnerable to break. No, the village has seen new water main breaks pop up during the undog days of summer too. Programs were even offering free showers to the residents back in October of 2021. Which is like, okay, thanks, I guess. Speaking of speechless thank yous, Governor Pritzker announced a plan in July of 23 that awarded Dixmoor a $14 million grant to help solve the problem. This is after the state funded a $2 million project to replace a 2-mile-long water main in 2022. Despite the grants and assistance, Dixmoor has continuously been crying for help from the county and state since 2021, yet the problems of water main breaks continue here in Dixmoor. Heck, here's a list of every Dixmoor-related story sorted by date on Chicago's Fox 32 website. I opened every water main break-related story in a separate tab, and by the end, I had 62 tabs in my web browser window. Good to know that the RAM that I bought earlier this year is holding up with 70 web pages open, Microsoft Word, and 3 Adobe apps all working at the same time. Definitely holding up better than Dixmoor's water mains, sheesh. Alright, well, it's not just water main issues that have been giving Dixmoor a bad reputation. In January of 2023, former Dixmoor police officer Tory Bridgeforth was facing 3 Class 2 felony charges in the form of child porn. The feds received a tip about Bridgeforth through content found on an old email account. He was an officer in Dixmoor from 2021 to 2022, and before that, he was an officer in nearby Robbins in 2019. More crappy leadership is back in 2020, then Dixmoor Mayor Yvonne Davis was accused of overpaying herself by $64,000. Even weirder is that when Davis left office, the next mayor, Fitzgerald Roberts, couldn't even get into the building. He and his trustees were forced to break in. Once they did, They noticed that security cameras had been ripped out of their place. Computers were missing, and so were some of the personnel files. The computers that remained were password protected, so they were forced to hack into them to be able to use them. The article continued to mention how police badges were missing, including the badge for the chief of police, and how there was only one squad car for the village. Plus, accounting was a mess. Many of the expenses didn't have an explanation for them. Care to explain, Yvonne Davis?
Nope.
Yeah, of course not. These kind of people never do. Seriously though, why is it so easy for these corrupt leaders, actually I shouldn't even call them leaders, more like corrupt misleaders, why is it so easy for a mayor of an Illinois village to hide and not have to answer crucial questions regarding missing funds when there's a huge deficit in the budget? I mean, it's not even this easy for pro athletes to avoid the media when all they did is miss a practice.
I mean, listen, we talking about practice.
I hope Davis has been practicing her fibbing skills, because apparently Davis told the village board that the $64,000 raise that she gave to herself was a computer glitch. Yeah, I mean, who did she think she was speaking to? A gullible yet innocent classroom of third graders? That's about as bad of a lie that a parent gives to a kid when the kid discovers what's actually in the medicine cabinet. Needless to say, Davis lost her bid for a second four-year term as mayor of Dixmoor in 2021. Before Davis was even the mayor of Dixmoor, the village had already dismantled their own fire department. Back in 2013, Dixmoor said that financial stress was the reason for the closure. Village leaders that year cited a budget deficit of over $1 million, and the solution was to close the firehouse, which cost the town over $700,000 a year to operate. Since then, the city of Harvey, of all places, has been providing Dixmoor with fire protection through a paid contract, in which Dixmoor claims is cheaper than running their own show. With all of these financial woes, and with Dixmoor having the inability to provide for itself in more ways than one, it wouldn't surprise me if the village of Dixmoor gets annexed by Harvey, or if something else happens to diminish the village in the future, and I don't think Dixmoor is the only south suburb in this kind of trouble. Only the future will tell, but it all comes down to money. If a municipality is not able to collect enough tax revenue to be able to provide basic services, or if it's so far in debt because of corrupt leadership, then there's no way that it can continue to operate as an incorporated municipality. Something's going to have to change eventually. I mean, I don't see people moving to Dixmoor in the future. The city is already below 3,000 people. The peak was only around 4,500. I see that population number continuing to decline, especially with all of the problems with the drinking water recently. So yeah, for those reasons, I believe that sometime in the future, Dixmoor is going to be no more. Well, let's take a look at the economic stats for Dixmoor, shall we? The village peaked at a population of 4,735 back in 1970. By 2020, that number was down to below 3,000, in an ever-shrinking number. Today, the population is estimated to be as low as 2,800. The median household income actually isn't as low as I thought it would be, as it's at $57,000 per year. Only 9% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and the median value of owner-occupied housing units is about where I thought it would be at $87,000. Lastly, the poverty rate is 20.8%. Overall, those are pretty bad numbers, but once again, they're not as bad as I thought they would be, and they're not as bad as some of the numbers that you'll see in some of the neighboring communities. Next up is the crime rates, in which the violent crime rate comes in at 327 for every 100,000 residents, while the property crime rate is 3,800 for every 100,000 residents. The data says that the most common form of crime is robberies. If you do a search for crime in Dixmoor, you can come across plenty of stories that have occurred here within the last year, such as Dixmoor shooting today, 3 wounded inside of a bar. Dixmoor man suspected of robbing 3 people at gunpoint arrested. Now, most homicide-related stories seem to have happened a half-decade to a whole decade ago, so it looks like things really have improved here in terms of violent crime. Regardless, the city has a history of violence. Like many poverty-stricken inner-city-like communities, things were at their worst here in Dixmoor in the 80s and 90s. I talked about this some in my Harvey video, but back in the 1960s, race riots were happening all over Chicagoland. Here in Dixmoor, one of the more memorable race riots for the greater Chicago area occurred, called the Gin Bottle Riots. It was August 16, 1964, when police arrested Blondella Woods, who was a black woman, for stealing a bottle of gin from Foremost Liquors off of the corner of 147th Street in Oakley. That's in Dixmoor, but it's right on the border with Harvey. In fact, I drove past the site in the beginning of the video, and here it is again. Ironically, a liquor store still stands there today. Well, when the woman stole the bottle of gin, the store owner noticed and went after her. She put up a fight and the store owner beat her up pretty good. Some black witnesses were standing right outside of the store and witnessed the beating, thinking that the store owner was doing that because the woman was black. Well, after Woods was arrested, the next day, there were as many as 400 protesters who responded by showing up to the liquor store. They felt like the store owner should have been arrested as well for beating up Woods, but he wasn't. The protests turned into a riot later in the evening when they started smashing the store windows with rocks. The rioters then turned to the nearby buildings and burned them down. Drivers passing by on 147th Street, which is a main thoroughfare for the area, weren't safe either. Rioters were targeting white drivers while tossing bricks and large stones into traffic. Overall, there ended up being 37 injuries counted for and 25 arrests. As many as 225 officers were needed to stop the riot. Despite the riot technically happening in Dixmoor, it was right on the border with Harvey, and Harvey was more so the recipient of the long-term violence from the gin bottle riot. Gang members started moving to Harvey throughout the late 60s and 70s, and by the 80s and 90s, violence was at its peak in Harvey, and once again, you can watch my video on Harvey for more on what has gone on in that city over the years. Another thing that Dixmoor would be known for over the years would be the criminal case of the Dixmoor 5. This is when a Dixmoor teenager was kidnapped at a bus stop in 1991, only for her body to show up later in a nearby field 3 weeks afterwards. The original Dixmoor 5 were in prison for 10 years, only for judges later to determine that they weren't the ones who committed the crime. They were rewarded a $40 million settlement for their time that they spent in jail. It wasn't until 2016 when police were able to determine who the real suspect was, and because the crime took so long to solve, it became a well-known case that has been associated with Dixmoor. Well, from crime history to founding history, Dixmoor was incorporated in 1923 under the name of Specialville, after Charles Special. Special was the first village president and was instrumental in getting Specialville incorporated. The effort was motivated by avoiding being annexed by the nearby cities of Harvey and Blue Island. Special owned as many as 70 lots in the village at the time. Specialville was also at a crossroads of some major historic trails. The Dixie Highway makes up the western border of the village, and in 1907 the Grand Trunk Western Railroad built a path through the community on a route from Chicago to Kankakee. Both the cities of Blue Island and Harvey wanted to annex Specialville because of the potential industrial growth. Land was being swallowed up in every direction, so every piece of land that was not already a part of an incorporated municipality was becoming more and more desired fast. Once Specialville was incorporated, it was always a residential community with a few industrial-zoned lots along the railroad tracks. In 1929, the village was renamed to Dixmoor, with the name likely being inspired by the Dixie Highway. Here's a 1929 map of the area where Dixmoor is still labeled as Specialville. This must have been towards the end of the time of it being called Specialville, since the name changed that year. Otherwise, there's not much history to mention about Dixmoor other than this large industrial complex here. To the right is a coal plant that was built here to power the steel plant which stood to the left. It was the Ingalls and Shepherd Forging Company who originally set up shop at this site in 1910. The steel plant was so massive that it required its own coal plant, so that's why the coal plant was here. Most of the steel plant has been demolished at this point, but the building that still remains is on the left. Currently, it's being used as a machine shop. Originally, the plant made steel parts for the auto industry and railroad companies. Chicago has always been a huge transportation hub, but it was even more so that in the early 1900s, so at that time, there was a lot of value of manufacturing steel goods right here. Hence why the Calumet region once had so many steel plants. In 1920, the Ingalls and Shepherd Company was acquired by a Massachusetts company called Wyman Gordon, in which this site is more known today for being the old Wyman Gordon plant than it is the Ingalls and Shepherd plant. Anyway, the plant continued to manufacture steel parts for autos and railroads after the acquisition. More on the history timeline of the plant and the sights and scenes in a few, as this aerial shot from 1970 shows you just how massive this steel plant was. In comparison, here's a view of it today. You can see that most of it has been turned into some kind of junkyard or metal scrapyard, while a large portion of it is just a brownfield. There's one small part of the old steel plant, like I mentioned, that is still in use, and that's the building that I was showing you earlier. Moving forward now, as during World War I, the plant transitioned into making parts for military and commercial aircraft. It was actively producing such products during World War II as well. After that, the Wyman Gordon plant transitioned to manufacturing titanium alloy jet engine parts for the U.S., being used in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Things went downhill quickly for the plant in the 80s, however. Demand for airplane parts went down significantly, with military budgets being cut after the war. The plant closed completely in 1986, which eliminated the remaining 350 jobs. This happened at the same time that there were quite a few plants that were shutting down in Harvey just to the south. While the plant was demolished in phases throughout the 90s and early 2000s, where the last remaining part of the plant and the power plant across the street have survived. Well, people, it is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that in Dixmoor you can't always trust the water, just like how on the radio you can't always trust the ads that end with a fast talker, but you can always trust Chris's livability score. The first category is education. Dixmoor high schoolers attend Thornton Township High School, which is located south of here in Harvey. The school performs very poorly on every level. It's not a good school. Education gets a 3 out of 20. Crime is next, and once again, things aren't as bad from that aspect as they once were in the village. It gets a 10 out of 20. Downtown is next, and there is no downtown Dixmoor, so that gets a 0 out of 20. Economy is next, and the economy for this south suburban area is in absolute terrible shape. Home values are extremely low, jobs are not anywhere to be found in the near vicinity. It's surrounded by other small suburbs that have long suffered similar problems to Dixmoor's, so that gets a 4 out of 20. Next up is recreational opportunities, in which there are none nearby, other than Kickapoo Meadows Forest Preserve. You have to drive quite a ways until you get to some of the better recreational opportunities that are offered in the region. It gets a 3 out of 20. Next up is history, and if it weren't for the old Wyman Gordon steel plant, there would be nothing interesting to talk about with Dixmoor's history. So it gets an 8 out of 20. Well, there was the gin bottle riots, of course, which was a big deal in the 60s, but okay, moving on. Amenities are next, and those are nowhere to be found in this town. There's a few off of 147th Street in the far southwest corner. Otherwise, if you head south, there's nothing. If you head north, there's nothing. If you head east, there's nothing. And if you head west, there's nothing. At least, not for quite a ways. So amenities gets a 2 out of 20. Last up is cost of living, which cost of living is dirt cheap in Dixmoor. For good reason, but it is. There's only a few homes listed for sale on Zillow at the time of me making this video. Only one with a price tag, and it's as low of a listed price as you can find in today's housing market anywhere. But with the corruption and with the city's financial woes, and with it being in Cook County, that comes with a cost, and the cost of living score gets a 16 out of 20. All in all, the Chris livability score for Dixmoor, Illinois is 46 out of 160, putting it right in between Harvey and Sauk Village, towards the very bottom of the list. I'd like to say that things will eventually turn around for the better, or at least there's some hope for it, but around here, there's really not that much hope that things will turn around for the better. I hate to say it, but I think it's true. I mean, Harvey is a very economically depressed city. There's not much tax revenue to be generated in Harvey. Companies have left, people continue to leave, and businesses continue to leave Harvey as well. Dixmoor's in the same boat. Both communities are very closely related, so once again, if you want to see my video on Harvey, you can check that one out right here. That being said, I'm out of here. Peace.